Good morning. The title of the sermon is The Way We Really Change. This is Transfiguration Sunday, the final Sunday of the season of Epiphany. I've shared over the last 6 weeks how important Epiphany has become to me personally, and hopefully it is becoming for you as well, something more than just the empty space between Christmas and Lent, which happens to start this coming Wednesday. For Orthodox Christians, this day, Transfiguration Sunday, is a very important and significant day. Starting back in the 3rd century, this story of Jesus appearing in his glory on the mountaintop, along with 2 dead persons, Moses and Elijah, as witnessed by Peter and James and John, was a big deal. It is an epiphany story. A story of seeing beyond the veil, seeing the transcendent realm, but also a seeing that includes a special knowing by Peter and James and John that these 2 dead people who were present with Jesus were Moses and Elijah, even though there is no way they should have been able to know that, but they did. Clearly, this seeing beyond the veil stuff is pretty amazing. When it comes to seeing beyond the veil, the Transfiguration story is really at the top of the list. Now, it's not as if Protestants and Catholics have ignored it. The Transfiguration story, which appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels, is part of the lectionary scriptures that are used in pretty much all Catholic churches and the majority of Protestant churches. Yet what our Orthodox brothers and sisters remind us is that this story is really a disciple story, more than a Jesus story. Their insight, which I find to be spot on, is that Jesus doesn't really change in this story. The change that takes place is in Peter and James and John seeing Jesus more fully, seeing Jesus with the veil lifted. And this profoundly changes them. And this is something that can change us as well. The Eastern Orthodox theologian Vladimir Lossky puts it this way: in the Transfiguration, Christ underwent no physical change, but a change occurred in the awareness of the disciples, who for a time received the power to see their master as he was, resplendent in the eternal light of his Godhead. The belief is that these experiences of seeing transform us. What I find interesting about this idea of seeing beyond the veil, or seeing what allows us to know about a greater reality, a transcendent reality, a literal seeing God close up, is how frequently we yearn for this. But we often yearn for this in a particular way, as somehow a proof that God is real. Thinking that if we could see a miracle like the parting of the Dead Sea, or Jesus multiplying a few loaves of bread and feeding thousands, that faith would simply blossom. Frederick Buechner, the ordained Presbyterian minister, gifted preacher, and award-winning writer of more than 30 books, often referred to as one of the most provocative thinkers and preachers of the 20th century, who, by the way, is still alive at 94, but no longer is doing a lot of writing. Buechner preached a sermon on the challenge of believing. He challenges this idea that seeing something we deem proof that God exists would change everything. In one of his most quoted sermons, Buechner tells this story. Suppose, for instance, that God were to take the great dim river of the Milky Way, as we see it from down here, flowing across the night sky, and were to brighten it up a little, and then rearrange it so that all of a sudden one night, the world would step outside and look up in the heavens and see not the usual haphazard scattering of stars, but out in letters light years tall would read the sentence, "I really exist." He writes, if I were going to try to write a story or a play about such an event, I would start, of course, with the first night this great theological headline appeared there in the stars, with suns and moons to dot the I's and the tails of the comets to cross the T's. and I would try to show some of the ways that I can imagine people might respond to it. I would show some of them sinking to their knees, not because they are especially religious people, but because it might seem somehow the only natural thing to do under the circumstances. They would perhaps do it without even thinking about it, just crumpling down on their knees there in the tall grass behind the garage. In the days to follow, churches would have to overflow into football stadiums and open fields. Wars would stop. Crime would cease. A kind of uncanny hush would fall over the world. But, Buechner writes, as time went on, I'm afraid that, in honesty, I would have to also suggest something else. At some point, a child would look up at those words in the sky, I really exist, and would say to a parent, what difference does this make? And the child's question, which is a very real question, would eventually result in the significance of the I really exist in the sky to fade. If its main purpose is to prove that God exists, without there being lives that are transformed by a deeper connection, a deeper communion, a deeper faith transforming us. Without that transformation, but only the supposed proof of the I really exist in the sky, it would indeed fade until, Buechner writes, the world returned to the way it was before it happened. What Buechner is suggesting is that information alone, that God really exists, even dramatic information, probably wouldn't be the game changer that we would like to believe that it is. And that's because what we need is not information. What we really need is meaning and faith-filled change. In the Transfiguration story, what makes this experience of Peter and James and John on the mountain so important is the way it transforms not only their understanding of Jesus, but their understanding of themselves. That they were persons who could see and connect with the divine, the transcendent. And that there are dead people on the other side that are very much alive. It is not the information that is significant, it is the transformation that takes place through it. In a sense, it opened up a different way of seeing, and this new way of seeing was transforming. In fact, so transforming that Jesus tells them to take some time and integrate this experience into their lives before they start talking about it. On Saturday, at Bill Allen's memorial service, two experiences that deeply affected Carol Allen were a part of the eulogy. The first happened the night before Bill passed. He was having a really tough time. Carol was sitting on the couch in the next room when suddenly she felt the presence of one of Bill's closest lifelong friends, another Bill, Bill Sharp, who passed away in 1999, had been a longtime member of this church and had been the husband of Geraldine Brannon. As Carol was sitting on the couch, she felt Bill Sharp's presence. How she knew it was him? She didn't know, but she knew it was him. And then she heard, again, whether it was an audible voice or an internal voice, she didn't know, but she heard him say, "It's time to let him go." Then on the morning after Bill passed, while Carol was brushing her hair in the bathroom, she felt her Bill's presence. And once she became aware that it was him, she heard him say, "I'm okay." And that was it. Carol shared with Neil and I that both of these experiences, both of these epiphanies, affected her deeply. They were very comforting. They were very affirming. Affirming of faith, affirming of hope, affirming of God, affirming of Bill being okay. Albeit no longer struggling with the host of physical challenges that afflicted him. She even shared that she told Geraldine about Bill coming to her Bill coming to her the day before, It's time to let him go. And Geraldine wasn't surprised in the least and told Carol that it sounded like her Bill in what he would say, and that she had had many such experiences, and that these experiences were an incredibly important part of her life and faith. After Carol shared her experiences, I immediately asked her if Neil and I could share them, and she said that it was okay. Then she laughed and said, "You can even tell them that I was brushing my hair in the bathroom." Years ago, following the death of my father-in-law, which took place in July of 2002, we had gotten word that something was really wrong with John, and that he was rushed to the hospital. And we immediately got in the car. We were living in Wairika. They were in Carson City, and we drove to Carson City, and he was unconscious. We couldn't talk to him. And the next day at noon, he would pass. One of the things that John did on a daily basis was he would walk his dog Trudy, and we got back from the hospital and just kind of numb and in shock. I mean, no one was expecting this. And twice a day he would walk his dog Trudy, a German Shorthair, on a route around the neighborhood. He'd walk up the hill and down. It was actually exactly 1 mile. And because he did this every day, and because he was a very extroverted person that connected with people well, everybody knew John, everybody knew Trudy. It was about 2 o'clock that afternoon. We had gotten home from the hospital, and Trudy hadn't been walked in about a day and a half. And so I said I would walk her. And I had walked with John and Trudy many, many times. He and I were kind of philosophy partners. And so I started walking Trudy around the neighborhood. And as I did so, people kept coming out and saying hello and saying, "Where's John? Where's John?" And so by the time I got to the top of the hill, I had already had to share the tragic news that John had passed away that day to at least a half dozen people. And suddenly my spirit was just overwhelmed with grief. And so I got to the top of the hill, and I prayed. And I prayed fervently, and I prayed passionately, but it was a very singular prayer. My prayer was, "God, allow me to know that John is okay. That's all I need to know. Just allow me to know that right now. Allow me to know that." In fact, I prayed so fervently and passionately that I was disappointed when it didn't just come. And so when I got to the back to the house and nothing had come, I didn't say a word about that. Nothing about my prayer that I wanted to know that John was okay. That's all I wanted. Well, that was the very end of July. And over the next month and a half, life got really full and really kind of crazy. We had planned a trip back to Chelmsford, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, which is where John grew up, where the family home was that went back 4 generations. So we made that trip, and while we were in the middle of that trip, we had been talking with Dora, Sonia's mom, about maybe moving to Wairika, and she decided that she was. And so we got back from our trip, and then we started preparing for her. She actually bought a house in very short order, and I would make almost weekly trips to Carson City. Sometimes we'd all go. A lot of times I would just go to get the house ready. We're going to rent it out and prepare her to move. So it was a really busy time. Well, in the middle of September, there was actually a Friday the 13th that I couldn't go to Carson City, but Dora was really hoping that Sonia and the kids could come and help her pack up and get ready. So the plan was that that Friday after work, Sonia would finish up work about 4:30, and that she and the kids would drive to Carson City and spend that weekend helping Dora pack up. And I had a wedding rehearsal and a wedding that Friday and Saturday, so I couldn't be a part of it at all. So on Thursday night, Thursday, September 12th, We set the alarm for 6 o'clock, as we normally did, and we went to bed. And at 5 a.m. on Friday morning, Friday the 13th, 5 a.m., the alarm went off. And I remember looking at the clock, and it said 5 o'clock, and Sonia, we set the alarm wrong. Instead of 6, we set it for 5, and reset it for 6, let's go back to bed. But no, she turned on the light, she sat up in bed, and she said, I just had the strangest dream I've ever had. It was one of those dreams where you dream, and you know it's a dream, but it's like real. They often call them lucid dreams. And so I sat up and she shared this dream. She said, in the dream, we were back in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, my dad's hometown, and I was alone, and I was walking around the town, and I was trying to find my dad's house. And I was incredibly sad because my dad was gone. And so I'm walking and I'm grieving and I'm crying and I don't know where I am. I'm lost, and all of a sudden this hand comes up and clasps my hand, and immediately I looked at the hand and I could tell it was my dad's hand. Sonia's dad was a great big guy, over 6 feet, but he had very short, stubby fingers. She said she saw his hand and she turned, and there was her dad. And he smiled. He had a wonderful smile. And she said, Dad, and she could barely talk. And he said to her, I'm okay. Now, by the way, I had never, ever told Sonia about that prayer, that's what I wanted to know. But that was his first words. He said, I'm okay. And then hand in hand, they walked and they talked. And he said, there's some things that you need to know. Now, by the way, this is like in real time. This is not in the past. She was filled with grief. Her dad had died, and there he was walking with her in the streets of Chelmsford, Massachusetts. He went on to share a couple of different things. Dora had been really worried about, the finances, and he said, you know what? When the life insurance is all paid out, she's going to be fine, which proved to be true. He said, I'm glad Dora's going to be moving to Wairika, but he said Trudy doesn't have very long, and sure enough, she only lived about 6 months further. And then he said, I know that you're planning to go to Carson City this weekend, but it's not a good idea. And she said, why not? And he said, the car's not safe. Have David check out the car. Just have David check out the car. And it was right then that the alarm went off. That was it. That was the last thing that happened. The alarm went off and the dream ended. And sometimes you don't remember dreams, but man, when the alarm ends the dream, it was like it was right there. So she shared that story, the whole thing, just exactly as I had shared it. And then she looked at me and she said, what do you think? And the first thing I said was, don't go to Carson City. Don't go to Carson City. And by about that time, we had to get up and get ready for work and get the kids to school. And so we quickly went about our day. But we had decided that Sonia wasn't going to go to Carson City. So Sonia got in. She headed into work. And she worked at the county, and as she came into her office, one of the people she worked with named Gary, he said to her, he said, there's something wrong with your tire. And she said, what? What do you mean wrong with my tire? Now, this car, the car she was driving was almost a brand new Chrysler Town & Country van. And nothing went wrong with her car. Nothing was wrong with her car in our estimation. That's why it was so strange when John had said that. And he said, no, I was coming across the parking lot and I could see the sun was shining, and on not the outside, but on the inside of your rear driver's side tire, there's a great big bulge. You can see this bulge. Something's wrong with the tire. So Sonia immediately called me up And she said, what should I do? And I said, well, I'm gonna call Les Schwab, and if in lunch you can go in and let's get the 2 rear tires replaced. And so I called up Les Schwab, and I said, we're going to replace the rear 2 tires. And sure enough, Sonia went in at about 11:30 into Les Schwab, and she didn't say a word. She just said, we're going to replace the rear 2 tires. And she sat down in the waiting room. And about 20 minutes later, the tire guy says, Sonia, come here. And so he had her walk back, and he wanted to show her. He said, I just wanted to show you. It's good you came in, because this tire, and he showed her the inside, and he said, this great big bubble there. He said, you see this? He said, this could have gone at any moment. And if you had been going 70 miles an hour down the highway and this blew, he said the whole tire just disintegrates when this type of a rupture happens. He said, it's really good you came in when you did. After that experience, we were deeply affected by that. It caused us to see things a lot differently, like we really did have that veil pulled back. One of the places I shared that was with a group of pastors that I met with each and every other month, a tight-knit group that actually we were together for over 20 years. And I shared that story, and Randy Anderson, one of the pastors, shared something that really changed the trajectory of my life and faith and ministry. After sharing that story, Randy said, I've heard an amazing number of stories a lot like that. He said, in fact, so often that now what I do when I meet with grieving families in preparation for memorial service, toward the end, I always say, I have one final question. Since the passing, have you experienced anything weird or strange? That's the language he uses, weird or strange. And he said about half of the time, people will say no. And they won't even know what he's asking about, really. Just no. But he said the other half of the time, he will hear something like, why are you asking that? He then will go on to share that often people experience transcendent moments where they catch a glimpse of their loved one beyond the veil. He said, I've been amazed by both the frequency of such experiences and how incredibly redemptive and healing and faith-enhancing they are. My father-in-law coming to Sonia in a dream happened 19 years ago. And since then, epiphanies have become a much larger part of my life and my theology and my ministry. And what I've discovered is that these very personal experiences, very unlike the I really exist story in the sky that Buechner tells, but these stories, unlike that, have not faded, but rather they have brought forth a lasting, redemptive healing and faith-enhancing transformation for me and our family, and I think for the churches that I've served. So on this Transfiguration Sunday, the crescendo of the season of Epiphany, we remind ourselves that the veil that normally separates this world from what we by faith affirm as the other side is like a curtain that sometimes gets pulled back, allowing us to see and to know, and most of all, to be transformed by what we experience. It worked that way for Peter and James and John. It worked that way for Carol and Geraldine. It worked that way for Sonia and I and our family. And if my friend Randy Anderson is right, this weird and strange stuff is pretty darn common and pretty darn powerful. This is the good news, this Transfiguration Sunday. Amen.